Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Digital Preservation, Audiovisual Edition, Part 1. Part 2 will be on Wednesday, March 13th. I am Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Stefan Elnabli at the University of California, San Diego Library. Stefan Elnabli is the library's media curation librarian and manager of digital reformatting operations, providing strategic direction in the library's management, preservation, and access of moving image collections, both analog and digital. Stefan's engagement with visual culture and digital repository development spans the areas of cinema studies, archival preservation, and repository service management. Stefan brings much expertise to today's topic, and we're fortunate to have him with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for the presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here's Stefan. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon, everybody, or morning. Thank you, Amanda, for introducing me, and I want to welcome everybody to this webinar series hosted by ALCTS, and it is titled Digital Preservation Audiovisual Edition. The webinar series is cut into two parts, and essentially, this series is going to be dedicated to a discussion of audiovisual materials in a digital preservation context. So we are going to discuss analog media, its properties and characteristics, and then speak about how we consider reformatting them into the digital domain, and also how we might consider working with born digital audiovisual materials, which is something that's different from analog media. So in total, the series will cover the basics of understanding AV media and how we want to consider these materials when we're engaged in a preservation and access context in your library or archive. So part one today is going to be dedicated to characteristics of audiovisual materials and the methods of generating digital audiovisual materials and how that influences the archiving process. And also considerations that must be made when selecting file formats in a preservation and access context. So the way that these series are divided will be sort of like part one is the setup for understanding analog media and how it influences digitizing, what considerations you want to make when you're selecting file formats. And then in part two, we'll discuss actually implementing those in a preservation context. I got a very nice introduction from Amanda, and I want to talk a little bit just briefly about myself, so you also have an understanding of how I function within my library. So I am the media curation librarian, and I also manage our digital reformatting operations. So functionally speaking, I am split, serving in the collection development and management program and our digital library development program. This means that I have my hands involved in media objects before they come into the library, while they're acquired, during the kind of collection management process, as well as the digitization and digital preservation process. It's sort of an end-to-end kind of role where I act as sort of like a format expert and media librarian and advise on matters relating to our repository services for media collections. So that's a particularly interesting place to be, mainly because it represents an intersection of things that I think all libraries and archives are dealing with respect to media. Our collections are ever growing. We're seeing more and more audiovisual materials entering our archives and libraries, and we're having to tend to those materials both in a physical environmental context, but also in terms of a preservation context. So there are a lot of questions that come up. Where do I start first? How do I go about setting up a basic digitization workstation or lab? How do I decide what I want to digitize first, and how do I decide what kinds of files I want to create that are sustainable? Sustainability itself is a very key factor when we're considering audiovisual preservation, because the files that we create are the things that we're going to preserve digitally into the future. So if we look at it from that perspective, we have to understand that digital preservation is very much an ongoing process, an endeavor that continues on and requires very attentive selection of file characteristics for the digitized files you're creating, but also an attention to policies. And all of that can be influenced by how we understand audiovisual media in our library or archive. So I just want to speak about our schedule. The first part is going to be an introduction and setting the context of part one. The second part will be looking at properties and considerations of analog audiovisual materials. And while this webinar series is called Digital Preservation, it is important to understand the materials that we're working with, to understand their properties and characteristics, so that once we make decisions on what and how to digitize something, we know what's important about the originals that we want to reproduce, that we want to preserve and make accessible to our access communities. The next section, I'll discuss how we might go about inventorying materials and why they're important, and how they might influence the digitization process. And then we'll speak briefly about different kinds of digitization setups in the film world, and then also in the analog video world, and take a look at what might be a viable workstation, something that can get you off the ground and running. Then we'll take a look at what properties and considerations of digital AV there are. So sequentially, we're kind of looking at first the analog media once it's digitized, and then what we're creating and why we're creating those things, and how in the last section they're contextualized in a digital preservation program, let's say. So I'll start with kind of setting the scene and talking about audiovisual materials in libraries and archives in a general sense, and why we should be paying attention to them. So I'm going to start off with a series of quotes. Here's a happy one for you. So audiovisual materials are the fastest growing segment in our nation's archives and special collections. This is very true. I have seen this in the variety of institutions I've worked in. As time goes on, you see more and more media entering archives because more and more of it is being created, and more of it was being created very easily. So if you think about it in the context of the development of audiovisual media, you had film, which could be labor intensive, expensive, and only captures, let's say, a certain amount of time per reel. Then you get into the video realm, well, where you can record hundreds and hundreds of minutes and hours of footage, which is limited by the actual tape stock. And then you get into the digital realm, where you have digital carriers like DV, or even born digital, meaning, let's say, the thing like the videos that you create on your cell phone or your digital camera that gets recorded onto a memory card or a flash drive. That is almost limitless with respect to how much footage you're creating because of decisions you might make of what kind of file you're recording, what's its resolution, what's its bit rate, and then also the how big your memory stick or USB drive is, etc. And we'll kind of get into what that means in a preservation context later. So here's something that's a little bit more alarming. So experts rank the lack of appropriate archival storage conservation facilities as their most challenging management issue, followed closely by the need to digitize. So environmental control and space for storage is an ever-increasing concern, especially with audiovisual materials because of the requirements for cold storage and humidity control. So when I look at this quote, I might even say that the need to digitize increasingly becomes paramount. It is almost the most, it is the essential kind of action in preserving media collections. Because the future of audiovisual media depends on digital conversion and the subsequent preservation of those digital files in a digital preservation context. So since we're battling against total degradation of materials, which is eventual, we must consider digitizing them very highly. And we must consider the resources required to do that and to effectively preserve the files created from that digitization process, which is a challenging endeavor. And I don't think that there is any institution who would disagree with that statement, that digitization and digital preservation of audiovisual media is very challenging. And that ranges from the smallest institution, library, or archive to the largest academic research institution. So now we have sort of a call to action here. So in the mid to long term, there is a major risk that carrier degradation combined with playback obsolescence will defeat the efforts of archivists. That's also very alarming, but it is a reality. In many cases, we're highly limited by our resources. That's across the board. And when you're dealing with audiovisual media, there is a high, a large amount of resources that must be dedicated to the endeavor. But I don't want to say that to intimidate anybody, because in my experience and what I see in many libraries and archives, the perfect is the enemy of the good, let's say. I'm sure you've all heard that kind of phrase. I believe that digital preservation in general is an iterative process. Doing anything now is a good thing. It does not have to be perfect, as long as we're seeking to reformat materials that we know are going to be obsolete and are going to degrade and become destroyed over time. So, having said that, we all feel like this in the beginning, but like I said before, there's always a starting place. And when we talk a little bit about what is a minimally viable workstation, we'll be able to take a look at how to get started, how to get off the ground, and start making a difference with your collections by preserving them. So, what do we mean by digitization? What do we mean by this concept of reformatting? So, digitization is the process of an analog signal changing to binary data. That is a bunch of zeros and ones. That's what comprises the digital files on your computer. And digital preservation is the endeavor to keep this binary data accessible and usable into the future. And the key word there is endeavor. So the diagram that you see, it's just a pictorial representation of what we're achieving from going from analog media materials to the actual digitization, and then creating them into this, turning an analog signal into a bunch of zeros and ones. So the bits that we're creating, that's the binary data that we're creating or migrating in the born digital context, must comply with best practices for preservation and need to consider the ways in which users want to access the data. So in light of this, we really do need to spend our time doing a little bit of research and self-education in the formats that we're dealing with. So we need to be format experts. We need to understand care and handling. We need to know about digitization and the actual process of migration. We need to know how the files we generate are going to be sustainable. And we need to know what metadata, and that refers to information about the files, what metadata we need that's important to make these files usable in the long term. And we also want to know, when we're thinking ahead, about how these things need to be accessed by our users. Because the way that things are accessed is going to influence what types of files that we create. Okay, so I just wanted to shift to a quick poll, just so I can gauge like what the audience is doing with respect to AV preservation. There are 3 questions, and our helpful ALCTS staff is going to set the poll up for you now. Okay, what I'm seeing here is that the majority of people have stated that it is a priority at your institution. That is, that's good to know. I would encourage those people who either, well, there are other aspects to why AV digitization and preservation might not be a priority, and we could talk a little bit about that in the question and answer period. But I would definitely encourage those people who don't know and who are interested in audiovisual preservation at their institution to get a sense from those people who are managing the collections to understand what their thoughts are about preserving the media into the future, and if anybody has considered digitization as an option. So we can go to the next poll. Okay, that's great. So what I saw before was that it was, let's say, roughly 60% said that it was a priority, 20 or so percent said that it was not a priority. However, we're seeing that almost 90% of people actually do digitize AV materials. So what I interpret from those results is that that institutions understand that there is a need for this kind of work, whether it is a stated priority or not. And that's good to understand, because digitizing audiovisual materials for preservation is really essential. So we can go to the next poll. Okay, the results here look pretty consistent with the last poll. So we're seeing 90% say yes. I was interested to see the results of this particular poll, because I know that digital preservation has multiple types of meanings to different people in different contexts, and sometimes people's strict interpretation of what digital preservation is might interfere, let's say, with acknowledging that they're actually doing something in that realm, or actually doing something that is positive with respect to digital preservation. So I am happy to see that 90% can say that they're engaged in these types of activities. So I'll go ahead and continue on. We'll go to the first section here, which is properties and characteristics of analog AV. So as we prepare to discuss the digitization process and the characteristics of digital AV files, I feel that it's important for us to review some of the properties and considerations of the analog material that will influence our future endeavors. So the properties and characteristics that I'll discuss will translate from the analog realm to the digital realm when we start to discuss file formats and properties and what we're actually trying to achieve from digitizing analog AV materials. So broadly speaking, there are two major categories: film and video, let's say. We'll start with film first. So analog film characteristics. One of the most important things to understand is the gauge of your film. And the gauge essentially defines the width of your film. If you're a cultural institution and you have film, it's very likely that it's going to be in either 16mm or 8mm formats. You see a lot of amateur films, sports films, independent documentaries, ethnographic films, and home movies in these formats. And you typically see those kinds of things in archives and special collections within cultural institutions. Now, if you still have circulating film collections, like UC San Diego, for example, I see in our collections tons of actual educational films coming from, let's say, the 1950s. And you see that kind of content in 16mm format. With respect to 35mm, this was an industry standard for theatrical motion pictures, so it's less likely that you'll find these in your collection. But I should mention also 9.5mm, which is an amateur format that you see in Europe. So the major characteristics of film include what is its color, if it has color. Is it black and white? Is it color? And if so, is it, let's say, a special kind of color? Different film bases and actual film stocks have different properties that that influence the way that color is represented, color information is represented on the film, and also influences how we might triage selection of film to digitize. So in the case of black and white film, black and white's made from silver metal particles. It's highly stable and it is unlikely to fade. In color, you see that there is 3 layers of dye: yellow, magenta, and cyan. Yellow is the least stable, so when it fades, it turns pink or magenta. So when you are speaking to somebody who manages film collections, or if you manage film collections, and somebody says that the film is faded, it's likely the case that they're referring to the fact that it looks red. And that is very typical with acetate-based films, and acetate-based films are the types of films that are that primarily consist within institutions. Another important characteristic that we want to consider is the actual format generation of the film. Is it a reversal? Is it a print? Is it a negative? So the vast majority of films that are amateur and independently produced are reversal stock. Essentially, that means the film that went into the camera is the film that got processed and turned into a print, meaning that these are unique materials. When we're talking about negatives and prints, film that is shot on a negative as a negative and then made into a positive print represents a workflow for film production where you'll end up having a negative, which is basically the closest to the source material that you can get, because that is the film that came out of the camera. And then the print is essentially a generation removed from the negative. So the main reason why I talk about reversal, print, and negative films is because when we're seeking to actually do digital preservation of our film collections, we want to get to the closest to the source of the film. And that would be either the negative or the reversal. Another aspect of film that we need to consider are soundtracks, optical and magnetic. Optical, well, I'll start with magnetic. Magnetic being a magnetic strip that contains the audio information that's been recorded, and then optical that responds to light as it's being projected. Some other aspects of film that we should consider when we're preparing them for digital preservation is what is the condition. I did state that environmental controls are very important. So considering that, it will help you understand what actual films you need to do first, because they might be more susceptible to complete loss. So let's take a look at analog video characteristics. So in the video realm, as you see on the right, it's kind of a cool little picture there depicting the kind of electronic process for creating video. So there's a visible spectrum of light. So analog visual input is recorded electronically. It's fixed in a magnetic medium. And that signal is then captured and reproduced for visual output. It's being recorded onto magnetic tape, which carries a magnetic signal. So the video players that you have, whether it's a VHS deck or let's say a U-matic deck, typically has what you call a video head that spins round and round and reads the information off the tape. This is just a quick kind of cross-section of what magnetic tape looks like, where you can see the top coat contains the magnetic particles that are being read by that video head and then turned into visual output. This is just a different representation so that you can see the different kinds of information that's contained on video. And I wanted to show these things, not necessarily to get too deeply into the specifics of how video is formulated, but to show you that there's a lot of information that's contained on these tapes, and any kind of deformation to the tapes can influence the digitization output. And there's different types of videos. You have open reel analog tapes, you have cassette tapes in the analog realm, and then you have cassette tapes in the digital realm. I would say an example would be digibeta or DV tape, where it's actual physical tape that carries that binary 0 and 1 information that we spoke about earlier. This is just a pictorial representation of different formats over time. These are all open reel formats that you might have seen in your library or archives. And then here's a variety of different tape-based formats. And I know that across the board, many institutions are very concerned with their VHS tape collections, because those are not only found in, let's say, archives and special collections, but in circulating video collections. And what we're finding is that some VHS tapes are becoming out of print. And then how do you preserve those and make those accessible to your patrons? I also wanted to mention, just like I did with analog film, that video is susceptible to a variety of different risks. Hydrolysis, which is also called sticky shed syndrome, is probably one of the main things affecting video collections. It actually can ruin both the video and the actual tape deck that you're using to play back the video. So when we're considering digitization, we want to be able to identify those tapes most at risk and prioritize them. So let's talk about inventories, digitization, and viable workstations. So another misleading perception about digital preservation investments is that choices are binary. Either we implement intensive preservation immediately and forever, or we do nothing. A relatively small investment may be enough to preserve the option of making larger commitments in the future. this is kind of that, getting back to that whole perfect is the enemy of the good. It gets back to this idea that I want everybody to consider that audiovisual preservation is an iterative process, and anything that you can do today that's better than yesterday is okay in my book. So we spoke about the physical analog characteristics, and that kind of when you're thinking about preserving media in a digital preservation context, we have to digitize, and therefore we need to understand what we're dealing with and understand whether we can do it in-house or we can do it or we must do it by outsourcing. That has to do a lot with resources, that has to do with the condition of the tapes, that has to do with the amount of tapes that we have, and that has to do with the actual digitization setup that we have in our institutions. So it's important to create inventories, to prepare yourself for a digitization project, and to make them as granular as possible with the information that will influence how you gather quotes, how you might perform quality control in the deliverables, whether you're creating them in-house or whether you are getting them from a vendor, and then also helpful in when we're thinking about digital preservation, because that metadata is going to be important for, let's say, administrative metadata that has to do with rights information and other kind of preservation actions that are taken on the materials, because 50 years from now, you might want to do an audit on your digital files to see how they were created, because perhaps a better technology out there can do a better job, and if you still have the original materials, you can redo it and create even better representations of the analog media. So this is an example of, let's say, of a collection that I once worked with that all we had was a card catalog, no information about the media, and what we had to do was inspect the media, gather all the information relative to the characteristics that I described. So you can create an inventory that has enough information for you to, as I said before, plan your project, gather quotes, assess what kind of digital storage you need after you create files. And in order to do that, you need some basic tools: film rewinds, a light box so you can actually inspect the films, a film loop so you can get up close to it. Since film is human readable, you can actually hold it in your hands and learn about it that way. Whereas in the video realm, you really do need equipment. And so eBay will be your friend. Maybe your arts departments have old media decks. They're your friends too. Surplus sales at your institution or elsewhere. It's always good to have as much as to get as much as you can, because if you have one deck that fails, you can use another one, or you can use the parts to help fix the one that's broken. So I talked a little bit about granular information. So the key characteristics that I would say that are important when you're planning digitization projects for audiovisual media in film is the gauge, it's the emulsion / the color that we talked about, the stock generation, and then some other things we didn't speak about directly, but the length of the film, what speed it was shot at, does it have sound or no sound, and the edge code. The edge code refers to when the film was actually manufactured. All of that information is accessible to you just by holding the film in your hand. In the video realm, you need to know formats. If it's an open reel, what is the size of the reel? Can you estimate the running time based on the size of the reel or the cassette? And then also, what's its recording standard? So we're talking about, like, is it recorded in SP or a different standard that might affect its running time? So what we want to do is get from this to this. Here are some basic digitization stations that you might consider. There are a variety, and this is just meant to be information about film digitization processes in general. However, I can cut to the chase and say most of the time in libraries and archives, you see two kinds of technology being used. One is telecine, which is essentially a film to video process where you're actually projecting a film and a camera is capturing that output. And then film scanning. Film scanning is the best option because what it does is create a series of images. So you basically get an image sequence, multiple files, and then you have the ability to digitize at a variety of different resolutions and specs. And that allows a lot more options in terms of, let's say, restoration if you needed to do it. And it will always get you better quality than telecine. In the video realm, there are some very basic things that you need to get started, and it really is quite easy. Essentially, you need a computer, you need a video deck to play back the video, you need an analog to digital converter, like the one that's shown here in the picture. If you can get your hands on one, a time-based corrector where you can actually route the signal through is important because that'll help stabilize it so that it actually can be captured. And you need capture software, and if you want to perform quality control software would be important. If you wanted to get very particular and technical in your quality control. A lot of this is very easily achievable, and I would highly recommend this resource linked here at the bottom because it allows you to get a sense of what's the most basic setup that you can achieve to get off the ground. This is the kind of a top-level look at decks, or excuse me, at the digitization workstation process here. And as we're running up on time, I'm going to get into the last section of our discussion today, which is the properties and considerations of digital video. So this is a similar kind of representation of how one might feel in the beginning when they're dealing with digital video files, whether they're being converted from analog materials, or you receive them, let's say, on hard drives or flash drives. A lot of this stuff just piles on and piles on and piles on. But there is a place to start, and there's a way to understand these files so that you can actually get intellectual control. So let's talk about some of the basic properties and considerations of digital video. One of the most essential aspects is that of a codec, which is essentially the two words coder and decoder kind of mushed together. Think about a codec as kind of the instructions for how a video player on your computer can understand the actual video file. It's sort of like the secret code that unlocks the video output so that you can actually play it back and read it. Some examples of common codecs that you'll see is H.264, MPEG-2, which is DVD, DivX, ProRes files. In the audio realm, you might see PCM, which is essentially an uncompressed type of file, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. FLAC, which is lossless, and then real audio, which a lot of institutions still have. So that's codecs. Now we have file formats. So file formats, it's a standard way that information is encoded for storage in a computer file. And file formats associated with audiovisual data are often called containers because they can hold separate streams of audio, video, and metadata. That makes them a little bit or a lot more complicated than other file types because what you'll see is that you might get a container with different types of codecs. So you can get different combinations of audio and video within the file. And representation of that can be seen here. So let's say you have at the top level, that's the general example of what a wrapper or container file looks like. It contains a codec, which is the essence of the audio or video information. Then you have different implementations of that. So let's say you have a Windows media file or a QuickTime file. That could contain a Windows media codec, it could contain a DV codec, or it could be uncompressed. And we'll talk a little bit about what those mean also. Then you get into the territory, okay, you can start to mix codecs. So let's say at the bottom right, you have a QuickTime file. The video is encoded as an H.264, and its audio is AAC audio. So it's important to understand what the difference is between those codecs, what they're used for, and how they influence the actual digital preservation process when we're thinking about file sustainability. The combination of codecs and file formats is rather large. On the left here, I've taken these tables from Wikipedia to represent audio formats and video formats. And the fact that you can see on the left, there are different containers that can also hold all these different types of codecs. And you can also see this division between what's called lossy, what's called no compression or uncompressed, and what's called lossless. I'll go back to that slide. Lossy, well, uncompressed information means that the bits that you're creating is the most amount of information that can be gathered from that digitization process. When you're considering lossy files, let's take that as an MP3. MP3 means you're making, lossy means that you're making a big file, like let's say a WAV file, which is uncompressed audio file, and you're making it smaller into an MP3. So a practical example of that is if you are trying to email somebody a file that's too large, your email client might say this is too large, you need to convert it, and by converting it into, let's say, an MP3, if it was a WAV file, you can make it into a smaller file. You actually lose information, and so in a preservation context, we want to look at either uncompressed or lossless. And lossless is a form of compression that when it's unpacked, goes back to the full amount of information that you had in the beginning. This is another representation of a container format, a very popular one that you'll see, which is MP4. And the reason why I'm showing this also is to indicate that these files can be complex and that it's important to understand the concept of containers and codecs, so that if you have a file or if you've made a file that is corrupt, you might be able to identify what became corrupt. Was it the video? Was it the audio? Is there something wrong with the metadata in the file that is causing the video player you're using to actually not be able to read it? So some properties and considerations of digital video to keep in mind are the video length, frames per second, video dimensions, bit rate, associated metadata, and then in audio, bit rate, sampling frequency, and the number of channels. You can inspect files on your computer using a variety of different tools to give you an idea of what you're creating, the codec, its file properties, and how these things are going to influence how you preserve them. So I did refer to some characteristics that are important to know, specifically bit depth. That is the amount of data recorded for each pixel. So the higher the bit depth, the better quality or higher resolution, you might say, the file is. Aspect ratio is an important part of video. Your televisions in the past were square, now they are rectangular. And in order to make a faithful representation of audiovisual materials that were designed for, let's say, a square, which is 4:3, you want to be able to digitize something so that it doesn't get skewed or stretched out. Some other considerations to make when you're dealing with digital files and preparing them for preservation is, what is the operating system environment currently at your institution? What are the media players that you have available to be able to play back files? And do those media players have codec libraries? So I highly recommend the free software VLC player, which comes with a free codec library that can play almost anything. So just to kind of recap this last part of this presentation, there are lossy, lossless, and uncompressed files. You want to be able to faithfully reproduce the original, and in order to do that, you need to capture as much information as possible, which means you need to consider either lossless files or uncompressed files. And some examples include the V21 codec in an uncompressed environment, or perhaps FFV1 in the lossless environment, and in film, 2K DPX file sequences. And in part 2, we're actually going to look more closely at the actual file types and codecs that are recommended when you're digitizing, and then how to digitally preserve those. So, general conclusion here. So the properties of analog AV, they influence the digitization process, and the properties of digital AV will influence the digital preservation process. Everything builds upon each other. And as I said before, in part 2, we're going to look closer at recommended file formats. We're going to investigate more deeply what those properties actually mean, and how they actually influence the digital preservation process. And we'll look at common scenarios that affect all libraries. More specifically, we'll take a look at, let's say, VHS collections, because that spans the board of all institution types. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. And it looks like we have almost 10 minutes for questions.
Great, Stefan. Thank you so much for this session. This has been really interesting. It's also, as you've said, it's a bit alarming in your alarming questions. A couple questions have come in. One is, and I suspect some of the questions that are being asked are going to be referenced a lot in your next part 2. So, so maybe you could give us a little teaser. In prioritizing the work that you do, you talked a little bit about prioritizing of the looking at the physical collections and seeing what needs to happen first. But for the digital files, are there formats that are sort of the least stable and most at risk that we should be focusing on first for looking at and worrying most? I suspect it.
Yes, I would say so. And that relates to this idea of sustainability. The Library of Congress, you can access on their website what's called the sustainability factors, and look at at different file formats and codecs to understand what are the risks related to those files. So that's generally, so generally speaking, the answer is yes. To be more precise, the kinds of files that have very low sustainability in general, and then also the files that you want to prioritize for doing preservation actions on are, let's say, the lossy types of files. If you have a choice between preserving, let's say, a JPEG, which is compressed, or a TIFF, which is uncompressed, you would choose the TIFF. If you have only a JPEG of a photograph, or well, that's in the photograph realm. Let me give an example in video. So let's say you had an MP4, which is compressed, and a 10-bit uncompressed file. You would take the 10-bit uncompressed file, but if you only have the MP4 and you still have the original tape, you'd want to redigitize that tape.
Okay.
Into some kind of lossless or uncompressed format. And then in the next part of the webinar, we're going to talk more about born digital materials, and we'll get into we'll get more into that question definitely when we're speaking about born digital materials.
Great. Another question, can you discuss the differences you find in laying out the ideal AV digitization workflows and what you actually encounter when you work with vendors?
Okay, I just want to, I'll recap the question just so I understand it. So the question is, what are the differences between an ideal digitization kind of workflow and that of vendors, or how do you...
Vendors, or maybe real life scenarios, and maybe not just vendors.
Okay, I think I understand the question. So yeah, let's say let's say you have a VHS collection and you need to digitize it for preservation because you don't have VHS players. You might make a DVD. That's not ideal in a digital preservation context, because what you're essentially doing is you're going from one carrier that's becoming obsolete and prone to degradation to another carrier that's becoming obsolete and prone to degradation, even if you actually digitized the tape. So in an ideal scenario, you might be using an audio to digital, an analog to digital converter that makes uncompressed files, and then you would actually put those files on a server somewhere or some kind of distributed preservation system, and then manage those files over time. Vendors will typically have all kinds of decks at their disposal that they can use. They'll have different AD converters that might perform differently for different purposes. They might have different kinds of software that can perform quality control in an automatic fashion, which kind of represents the ideal scenario. Whereas at your institution, you might just have, let's say, a PC workstation and a little digital conversion box, and you're creating DV files. There is a difference. One is not ideal. However, you're still actually digitizing and doing something, which I think is the ultimate goal. But understanding where you could get to and where you want to be is pretty much the first step. And knowing the risks and the sort of risk of loss of your collections is a way to kind of convey to your administration that you need more resources in that realm. And you can use some of those alarming quotes to get them to get on board with what you want to do.
Okay, we are out of time, except there was one question maybe you could answer in 1 minute. And one person asked that you said that you mentioned that you they read differing opinions on whether to keep originals or toss them, and are you saying they should be kept in case you need to redo?
I'm of the opinion that you should keep originals.
Sure.
That is sort of like an archival maxim sort of thing. I understand that there's always going to be kind of a battle for resources and a battle for space. And if you need to get rid of the originals because you're happy with what you've digitized, and you might get a directive from your administration that you just have to get rid of it. But I recommend keeping originals because that increases the probability that that media is going to survive in the future, because you have different copies and different formats. And if you lose the digital file, you can go back to the original, or if you find out in the future you can make a better file, you can go back and make a better file.
Okay, thanks for answering that last question. We are glad you could be with us today. Everyone will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and the recording. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I'd like to thank our presenter, Stefan Elnabli, and thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Felicity Dykes, Joseph Olivares, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. We have several more webinars this spring, including Research Methodologies and Digital Analysis, part of the Research and Publication Basics series, and we also have part 2 of the Digital Preservation Audiovisual Edition. We also have Library of Congress BibFrame Progress. See the ALCTS website to register or to find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on March 19th on knowledge-based management. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.